So where we left off, we had talked about here, the small tree of the victory sphere as the consciousness of the soul climbs up that tree. When it gets to the sphere of Christ, beauty, it's the sphere where Christ manifests as the Messiah and the Savior. The desire nature gets reprogrammed. So the desires of the false self system, so forth, self-destructive habits and desires get more and more eliminated, and they're replaced with the desires for spiritual growth and spiritual service to God's plan. And through the tunnel, or the Doth sphere, of this sphere, transition is made up into the sphere of Christ's beauty. And this is a major event in the soul's spiritual journey, because it does mark the transition from being primarily rooted in human ground into becoming re-rooted in spiritual ground as the core of our identity, sense of who we are. And we truly know ourselves as a spiritual being, and that this is our true identity, and we're able to take an overview, a new overview of the personality construction down below in the personality astral triad, and realize that this is simply a complex or a configuration of energies and faculties that we need to use for functioning in human life, or human ground. The foundation sphere is the source of our universal survival security instinct. I'm reviewing a little bit. The splendor sphere is the source of our power and control need, which, legitimately speaking, is a need to have freedom and independence in our own life as an individual, and to make decisions about what we're going to do with our life, how we're going to live, who we're going to spend our time with, and so forth. And then the victory sphere, the emotional sphere, that's the source of our basic need for affection, esteem, and approval. So the happiness programs related to the wounding of those needs by neglect or trauma or abuse happen when our needs in those spheres are not adequately met. And then unconscious programs to compensate are created. And then those become the drivers of our unconscious emotional motivation. So all of that has to be healed by the divine action working in us through our consent in our daily practice of centering prayer over an extended period of time. And that is what happens. We also have needs for sensation and pleasure, and intimacy and belonging. The sensation pleasure needs affirm life. So they kind of grow out of the survival instinct because they affirm that it's good, and they help us to desire to have more of the life. We experience that whenever any of our other needs are being gratified. It's enjoyable and pleasurable. The intimacy belonging need is twofold. It's both a social need and a spiritual need. As a social need, it's our need for meaningful relationship and connection with others and intimacy with others. And also, it involves our identification with our peer groups and our society and our cultural conditioning, all the things that our human identity is constructed from, our religious background, our ethnic, racial, social, economic, national background, and all these different kinds of backgrounds, which are the pieces that make up our sense of who we are as a separate human being within a particular group or a set of groups that we identify with and conform to, and are conditioned by to a greater extent than we may know. As a more internal or spiritual need, the need for intimacy belonging is the need to have intimacy with ourself, which comes through knowing the truth of our soul, both its light side and its dark side. And this, of course, is facilitated greatly by the interaction with us of the divine consciousness, which reveals us to ourselves. And then, of course, we have a need for intimacy with God. Intimacy with God, I was just reading this morning, intimacy with God is what is meant by recovering our lost innocence. In some of the liturgical terminology, and the idea that before the fall, Adam and Eve were innocent, they had an intimate relationship with God, then that was lost, and so the spiritual journey serves to restore that lost intimacy. So we call the recovery of our lost innocence. So the intimacy with God is a key piece. And it happens as we climb the small tree. We're getting a lot of static here. As we climb the small tree in the sphere of Christ's beauty. As we climb this tree, we get an overview of our personality, where we see it as it really is, and for what it really is, and we come to know ourselves as what we really and truly are as a spiritual being. Now, each time the evolving soul or consciousness moves up to the smaller tree in a higher sphere, through that small tree's connection to the bigger tree, it grows. All the spheres evolve and grow more within that smaller tree. Does that make sense? It's a little tricky. Yes?
So when we talk about the soul moving up the tree, are we always in one place during a particular lifetime, or can we be kind of in multiple?
Well, at a particular point in our life, we are doing our evolving in a particular sphere. And we may move from that sphere into the next sphere, evolve through it, and even move into another sphere. That all depends on the trajectory of our spiritual growth and journey. We may spend the entire life in one sphere, or we may move through a number of spheres.
Can you re-raise?
Well, I think that would be rare, but it's certainly a possibility if you chose to go over to the dark side or something, you know.
Because sometimes as you develop spiritually, you're able to be kind of got a little psyche and all that stuff, and you can kind of be corrupted.
Well, yeah, those are some of the dangers actually that are connected with this. Like in the sphere of foundation, often a person has a lot of psychic experiences and visionary experiences, and there are like kind of darker beings that inhabit that realm. So it's very important to keep focused in your spiritual center, especially when you're going through the passage of the dark invisible sphere in that center, and not to allow yourself to be distracted by some of the things that might approach you, because they will at times. This is a very individual thing, so it's different for different people. A lot of it just depends on where our heart is and how strongly our motivation is to grow in the spiritual journey, and how weak we are to temptation depends on the nature of our emotional happiness programs as to what particular areas in which we're liable to be most strongly seduced or tempted. When there's a temptation to gratify a particular program that's really strong in a person, then the person is not going to recognize it as a temptation. They'll tend to see it as an opportunity, you know. So there's so many different combinations of what the actual false self system is in different individuals that it would be like going through a dictionary or something to try to describe them all.
Now that you're on the dark nights, you're talking about dark nights. One of my points that I wanted to talk about was the scariness of the dark night. And was it the Desert Fathers who went into the desert and they lived alone and they went through the sense of darkness?
Yeah, Thomas talks about St. Anthony of the Desert and the spiritual journey tapes.
Yeah, I'm thinking of St. John of the Cross.
He was the founder of that monasticism that developed in the desert that you referred to. St. John of the Cross was more like the 14th, 15th century.
Was that before or after?
That was quite a while after St. Anthony. Yeah, St. John of the Cross was roughly 500 years ago. Relatively recent in comparison.
Why unknowing? So my question is, he talks about really physically having a fight or a struggle during that time. Was that his imagination, or did he come out of that physically harmed?
Are you talking about
St. John of the Cross?
St. John of the Cross?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe.
Do you think that was just an imaginary
Yeah,
thing?
I think it's a psychological, it's a real thing, but it's not physical, it's psychological. So
He describes it so real.
it's meant to be understood on the allegorical sense of Scripture, not on the literal sense.
Okay.
But it's a drying out of the faculties. Another thing about these spheres of the personality astral triad is that the foundation sphere is the faculty of memory. The splendor sphere is the faculty of intellect, and the victory sphere is the faculty of imagination. Those are the three classical faculties identified by Christian psychology of the scholastic age, which St. John of the Cross related to. So we worship God through those faculties, through different types of cataphatic prayer and worship. During the night of sense and the night of spirit, those faculties are dried out, and it's sort of like the juice or the energy or the inspiration that people felt from worshiping that way goes away, and it's just flat. So the image of a desert is used as an allegory to the experience of consciousness just feeling bored. Nothing's happening. Where is God? Why am I doing this? And it's painful, and there is a fear that God's abandoned me. So our faith is tested in that. And this is very much what Lenten journey is about. It's what the time Jesus spent in the desert after his baptism was about, when he received the 3 classical temptations that also relate to those same energy centers. You know, the security center was to turn stones into bread, which represents the material thing, and the power and control center was, you know, worship. The devil said, worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth. You know, that's pretty transparent what that's appealing to. And then the emotional center was to jump off of the parapet of the temple and come down and not be hurt. It's like being a big miracle worker, show off, so people would see how great you were. So that's appealing to that center. We all have to go through that same type of temptation in our spiritual journey, but we don't go through it exactly the same way it's described that Jesus did in the Bible, but we go through that same process, each in our own individual way in our individual time, depending on what our particular needs are. But it's all dealing with what's involved in this personality astral triad, these basic spheres. Does that answer your question? There's a sphere associated with each one of them. You asked about the fear. The main fear, when you're going through the passage of the invisible sphere, or through a dark night, is you feel like the familiar world that you had in the sphere you were in, that you were comfortable with, it's starting to fall apart. It's being dismantled. So you go through a kind of like a psychological, not a physical, but a psychological dying experience. You feel like you're losing everything. If it's in the mental sphere, you feel like the power of your mind to understand things and to put everything into logical order and all that, you're losing that. So you feel insecure. Vulnerable. Oh, it's totally about vulnerability. And then, like, if it's in the victory sphere, you feel like your emotional stability is gone. And you feel emotionally impoverished and insecure. When you arrive in this beauty sphere, everything comes back together, because this is the sphere of the integrating, transforming consciousness. So everything gets reconstituted on a higher level of integration, harmony, and unity. So you're more together than you ever were, because all of these faculties are reintegrated and they're subordinated to the divine indwelling, to the spiritual rulership of the true self. Or in Kabbalah they call it the higher self. And this higher self is one with God. It's part of God, but it's also an individual consciousness. Which reminds me of one of the points I need to make. This is an idea that came to me in the last couple of months. It's another way of really just repeating something you've already heard, that you already know. And basically it's this. God's consciousness is literally infinite. And it's universal. Each of us has a limited individual consciousness. And so for each of us, our individual consciousness is the center of our own unique personal world, through which we relate to the kingdom sphere, the part of it that we're in on this planet, here in this solar system, and what's around us. We relate to our physical body, and through this individual consciousness, we relate to ourself, and we relate to God, whatever God is, right? or whatever we think God is. And our ideas of God can come from any of these spheres or a combination of them. So we are an individual consciousness. We only have one center of consciousness, which is me, for each of us, our individual center. Now, now, shifting back to the divine, to the universal consciousness of what we call God, which is infinite love and divine mystery. The divine consciousness of God has an infinite number of individual centers of consciousness within itself, and each of us is one of them. Do you get that? Okay, I'll repeat that. Yeah, because this, try to plug this into your framework. It's very much worth reflecting on, and it's simply a new way of expressing something that's been expressed in many ways, where Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Basically, is expressing the same idea, but this is using a little different language. Each of us is an individual, limited consciousness. The divine universal consciousness is unlimited, and it has an infinite number of individual centers of consciousness within itself. And every individual soul in God's creation, which includes all the spheres on the tree of life, is one of those centers of consciousness. So, God's divine consciousness is already 100% intimate with and united to each one of us, and is co-living our life with us and experiencing with us everything we're going through in our life. Never is separate from us, from God's side of the relationship. It only appears that God is separate from our limited consciousness on our side of the divine relationship, which is centered in my individual center of consciousness that's relating to God. But God is already embracing all of us. That's why, as Thomas Keating said, God is closer than thinking, closer than choosing, closer than consciousness itself. For everyone, all the time, no matter who we are or where we are. Because there is no limit to what is infinite. That's what the word infinite means. So the divine consciousness is always with us and within us and around us. And the level on which we are aware of the divine consciousness is only limited by the limitations that we put upon it by the level of our faith, openness, and consent. The more our love nature grows and evolves, the closer from our side of the relationship we may grow to God, who is already present to us all the time. Now, something also that I like to say now is that the way that God loves us is perfect, and it's not the same way that we humans tend to love. The reason for that is that we humans tend to love with a certain amount of conditionality and attachment to whom or whatever we love. And of course, love is the strongest glue of the connecting consciousness that brings us into co-identification with others. Now this will be paradoxical also. It's kind of a non-dual idea, but God is essentially transcending all the dualities upon which creation is based. And if we can get through the whole tree, we'll get to explain why that is later. But this is the way God relates to us, each of us, to each individual center of the divine consciousness, which is one of us, and all other souls. God relates to all of us with infinite detachment, infinite intimacy, and infinite love, all at the same time. The reason for the infinite detachment is because God has given each of us an individual free will to make free choices. So God is detached and allows us to make our own decisions and choices. But at the same time, is infinitely intimate with us, one with us, and loves us infinitely and unconditionally. As we gradually mature in our love nature, we will gradually learn to love the same way that God does, which is with an infinite detachment, infinite intimacy, and infinite lovingness. The detachment is also a kind of a freedom, because it gives complete freedom to the one that is loved. There's no strings attached, there's no possessiveness, there's no conditions. It's just love, no matter what. And that runs very counterintuitive to the normal way that we think and respond in the levels of consciousness that we experience in our human ground, which is the personality astral triad and the kingdom sphere. So it's only through the spiritual journey when our personality expression in the personality astral triad becomes a unique individual expression of who we are as a spiritual being that we can begin to do that. The task of the spiritual journey is to integrate our spiritual ground into our human ground. And this is our individual spiritual ground, is this spiritual moral triad. Get my pointer out here. It's the beauty sphere, the severity sphere of justice, and the mercy sphere of love. These three spheres make up our individual spiritual ground. As we go up the tree, I'll be talking more about that. So, as we mature up the tree, our little trees, they evolve and mature, and say we're in this beauty sphere. This is when the false self starts becoming more and more converted into the true self of who we are. And we let go of the values and the desires and the intellectual perspectives of the false self that we relied upon and clung to when we were only identified with ourself as a human being and not as a spiritual being. So there's a revolution that occurs in our consciousness. It's a revolution of our sense of identity, who and what we are, because who and what we are in the beauty sphere becomes grounded in the divine relationship, because we realize that who we are is a son or daughter of God who loves us unconditionally and is inviting us into this divine relationship to deeper and deeper degrees so that our soul may become perfected to help perfect God's creation. It has to occur in us, in other words. Are you all with me here? Now also in the course of evolving into this sphere, we start to transcend many of the limitations of human nature and human existence in order to start becoming a divine being. And in fact, when the soul is fully, when the small tree of the soul is fully in this sphere, there is no need for any more life experience in human ground in order for the soul to learn and grow, because it's already mastered at that point all the lessons of the human experience. But there may be a need in the service of God's plan to reincarnate into human ground in order to help with the spiritual development and evolution of the human condition in other people and groups of people. So from this point on, human birth becomes more of like a sacrifice than a necessity. And of course, like the example of Jesus, is a soul that was at the very pinnacle of the tree, who was a manifested, fully manifested Son of God, who took human birth, human incarnation, solely for the purpose of raising up humanity. And there's a lot of valuable allegorical symbolism in the Tree of Life that is related to the birth of Jesus. And we'll see if we can touch upon some of that as we proceed. But service to God's plan increases as we move up. It starts in Christ's beauty in the small tree of this sphere, and it increases more and more as we evolve up. But as we are service to God's plan, that accelerates our spiritual growth. As Thomas Keating has said, one of the great safeguards on the spiritual journey, as we receive the new energies of the divine life being breathed into us, to prevent us from developing spiritual pride and becoming too self-centered in our own journey. It's sort of like you've got a river that's flowing, and the two banks that keep the river, this is an open mind, open heart, they keep the river where it's supposed to be, are one, dedication to God is one bank of the river, and the other bank is service to others. And those two things together promote our spiritual growth. Because if we don't do both of those, then we're liable excuse me, we're liable to succumb to the temptation of spiritual pride and develop too high an opinion of ourselves, which is what has often happened to many spiritual teachers and gurus and so forth. Because what happens is, once they evolve to the top of the small tree in one of these lower spheres of the personality astral triad, they think they've actually reached the top of the entire tree and that they're already a perfected soul. But they're not. They still have a very long ways to go. So that's kind of what the temptation of spiritual pride and subtle egotism is all about. The person has what seems to be a very spiritual ego, and they may be very righteous, but this pride gives them a feeling of superiority, subtle feeling of superiority over others, instead of realizing that because we're all one, we're all the same, we're all equal. And the divine energy that comes through us is a gift. It's not what we are. It's not our credit, it's not our possession. It's a gift to us that comes through us that's meant to help ignite the flame of spiritual longing in the hearts of others, so that they may become a flame of the same that we're all parts of. And there's more peace, love, joy, and fulfillment in that than in any kind of a superiority trip of spiritual pride. That's one of the final temptations, is the temptations of self-righteousness and spiritual pride. And it's the last vestiges of the false self, or of the subtle ego, and it can be very, very subtle. That's why there's not only a night of sense, but a night of spirit. And then Thomas Keating has said there's beyond that, there's what he calls the night of self. So the purification process continues all the way to the very top of the tree, which is a long, long ways from wherever any human being on earth is now. Though there may be a few hidden exceptions to that, of souls that are extremely highly evolved, that are incarnate physically on the planet for the purpose of helping the planet to evolve. But those souls are not celebrities, they're not public figures. They work in secret. The celebrities or public figures are their students. And a lot of times their students succumb to this subtle temptation of having too high an opinion of oneself. I've seen this myself. And it's a challenge, but we all face challenges all the way. So when you get an idea of what the scope of this journey is, it helps to make you feel a little more humble. Even though you may have received some gifts or whatever, you start to realize that these are gifts. They're not possessions, though. And there was something that this Carmelite priest said at an Ash Wednesday service that I went to with Sandy and Michelle that really struck home to me. He was talking about if a person has a certain spiritual gift, well, when it's time to use the gift, God will give it to you. And then you use it. And then after you've used the gift, God takes it back. Until it's time to use it again. And I thought, well, that really fits, like for me, for when I give a talk or when I'm doing my writing. So it comes when it's meant to be there, so I know it's not my possession, and then it goes. And when it's time to use it again, it'll be given again. And if it's not time to use it, I'm not going to get it. So it's not my gift. I can't be possessive of it. And so that's a safeguard, really, against humility is the best defense against all types of sin and egotism and spiritual pride. Real down-to-earth humility, along with gratitude. So, people on this level can transmit divine presence to others around them and awaken in them the flame of the same, so that they experience it for themselves, within themselves, in a way that otherwise would take them a long time to develop if they were just developing it on their own without the help of a live transmission of spiritual energy. So this is really the value of a live transmission, is that there's an energy that goes through the transmitter. If people can receive it, it will energize the higher spheres in their souls to help them awaken and to awaken their intuition so that they get a spontaneous understanding of the deeper knowledge that's already within them, that comes from the imprint of the divine indwelling, of being created in God's image and likeness. That's one reason I said earlier on that I can't tell you anything that you do not already know on some level within you, because all of us have the divine image within us. We all have the complete tree of life within us, at least as potential. It only becomes manifested in our consciousness as a living reality to the extent that we evolve up the tree through the smaller trees within all these spheres. So in order to reach the summit of the tree, the individual soul and consciousness needs to climb the tree. The individual soul and consciousness needs to climb the tree 10 times. One time for each of these visible spheres. And each time it climbs the tree, it has to go through a passage of doth the cloud, the invisible sphere which always marks the transition. And the transition means the former world passes away. The former construction, stability of the ego is dismantled and falls apart, so that a newer, more higher evolved one may be created to take its place on the next level of spiritual growth. And the main principle in going through these dark passages, particularly when the going gets rough, is you need to rely upon the protection of the center within you. It's like a shelter, and then around that center the storm may rage, the storm of the dark night. But don't get sucked into the storm. Just focus on your heart center, or on that spiritual center within, and trust that God is within you and is bringing you through this, even though you may not have any consciously felt experience of God's presence. God is there, always. But the dying process involves an experience of abandonment, just like Jesus experienced when he suffered the temptations in the desert, and as he's experienced, I think it's in Luke's Gospel, when he was dying on the cross. And he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So he was experiencing that same sense of being limited to his separate human self without conscious experience of his oneness with the Father. But in truth, the Father was one with him during the entire thing from the Father's side of the divine relationship, but not in the consciousness of Jesus when he was reduced to a human being who had lost the consciousness of his union with God because he took on the sin, suffering, and alienation from God of the entire human race, past, present, and to come. That was the cup he had to drink that he didn't want to drink. It was much more painful, devastating, and agonizing than the physical suffering and trials of his Paschal mystery journey. You know, being rejected, whipped, beaten, nailed on a cross, and dying a painful death. That was just the literal level of it. There were other deeper levels, allegorical and spiritual particularly, and I suppose there was a moral level too, because on the moral level, he was liberating all human beings and opening up a path to divine union for all souls who follow him on his journey. And in order for us to follow Jesus on his journey, we have to, within our own soul, on the allegorical level, not the physical, we have to go through the same processes that he did. We have to go through the temptations in the desert, and we have to take up our cross and follow him, and go through the Paschal mystery. And the death of the false self, on the crucifixion of the false self, as Thomas Keating has taught us, is followed by the inner resurrection of the true self in our soul. Each time we make a passage from the smaller tree in one of these spheres, and we go through the invisible sephira, and we die a little death, we experience an inner resurrection of some of Christ's life within us. And as we evolve up the tree, that inner resurrection of Christ's life within us continues to evolve and unfold to higher and higher levels. Oh man. Once it gets to the level of beauty, though, Christ's beauty, the whole game is changed. Because our struggles with the temptations of the struggle of good and evil, all of that occurs only on the levels of the personality astral triad. Because the forces of darkness or evil or destruction cannot function above this level, because they cannot bear to be in the presence and the light of divine love. They have to hide in the dark recesses of these spheres, in the dark recesses of the soul and the smaller trees within them, particularly in the foundation sphere. But also they have places in the splendor and the victory sphere. And there are like little entities, little beings, or evil spirits or demons, which is biblical language for them, that live in these places. And they try to suck our energy from us. They tempt us and test us, but in a way they help us to grow stronger, because when we resist the temptations, it makes our willpower stronger and brings it more into alignment with the natural integrity of our soul, which comes from the integrating, transforming consciousness in the sphere of Christ and beauty within us. And that sphere is present in the small trees of every one of the little trees, in each one of these spheres. So this idea about the small trees is a real key to understanding how this process of spiritual and consciousness evolution works. I tried to put the pieces together before I was given that insight, and I was having a real struggle. But once I got this idea about the smaller trees, it was told to me. I didn't just come up with it myself. By someone who had studied this in a temple of Christian Kabbalah. My sister, actually. Then it all clicked and fit into place for me. So I'm really trying to emphasize this to you, because it will greatly help you in your understanding. So we can proceed further now, or would you like to take a short break? Okay, why don't we take a short break of 5 to 10 minutes, and I'll start again, about a little bit before 10 after 2. And what we'll do is we'll go the rest of the way up the tree, and then if there's time, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the energy paths that connect the spheres and these symbols that are on those paths, because that sheds more light on this wonderful thing.